Well, good afternoon, everyone. I'm Kellye Testy, the President and CEO of the Law School Admission Council, and I'm delighted to be with you today for Live with Kellye Ken. And I'm here with my co-host, Dean Ken Randall. I also want to welcome Dean Trish White, Dean Kim Yuracko, Bob Morse from U.S. News, and Michael Sauder, who's joining us as a professor of sociology from the University of Iowa. We're really thrilled to welcome you to March Madness, and that's the time of year it is. And I know that it always brings with it a lot of fear, a little bit of trepidation, some excitement, and many other emotions as well as we think about it's time again for those annual law school rankings. So we wanted to bring this program forward today to talk with some experts in this field about what those rankings mean and don't mean, and just all the various factors that influence the way we think about that in legal education today. So we're really thrilled that you've tuned in, and what we're going to do is I'm going to turn this over to my co-host Ken Randall, who has a series of questions for our panelists, and then we'll engage the dialogue in that sense, looking for some questions from our audience too. And I'll be adding those to our discussion as we move forward today. So thank you very much for joining Live with Kellye and Ken. And Ken, it's great to co-host with you, and I'll turn it over to you now.
Great, thanks, Kellye. It's a pleasure to be with everyone. We have so many registrations. We'll probably have almost 300 people live logging in, and then of course a tape of this program will be available on archive. I want to start with Professor Sauder. Michael, legal education really does appreciate an interdisciplinary perspective. So I've been reading your book of great renown called Engines of Anxiety: Academic Rankings, Reputation, and Accountability. And I'm going to start with a quote from your book, which says, "The U.S. News Law School rankings, much like educational rankings of other fields, creates a very public hierarchy among law schools, one that overwhelms other conceptions of how schools might be compared to one another. However, legal education is unique. In this field, one ranking entity has a monopoly of public perception, and all accredited law schools are ranked together according to the same metrics." So Michael, help us to unpack what you've written there. First, that there's one dominating ranking entity, U.S. News, and that therefore one set of metrics is used to judge all law schools.
Yeah, that's a great question. And, I think for better or for worse, rankings are part of the modern educational landscape. And this is, part of a bigger trend, not just in education. Public accountability measures are becoming increasingly common throughout all aspects of our lives. But colleges and universities all over the world now have to take rankings into consideration. But as the quote you just read indicates, law schools are fairly distinctive, that there's a single metric that is applied to the entire field and does not really have any serious competitors. So if you look at business schools, for example, they have multiple rankings that people look at and consider. If you look at global rankings of colleges and universities, there are also many different rankings that people can consult. And even the U.S. News rankings of colleges and universities divide schools into categories based on their particular aims and their particular missions. But being subject to just one ranking, Wendy Esplund and I have argued in our book, really exacerbates the problem generated by the rankings and the unintended effects that I think they produce. We provide a lot of examples in our book about how rankings are reactive. And by that we mean that when you measure, if you measure natural phenomena like the temperature, when you measure it, you don't really affect it. But when you measure people, people change their behaviors in response to being measured. And so social measures never simply reflect an underlying social reality, but they actually change that reality. And I think having a single measure really encourages people to adopt behaviors or strategies aimed at changing the numbers without necessarily changing the qualities that those numbers are designed to represent. And these are made worse by just having one ranking. And I guess one smaller point I would add is just another of the dangers of having a single dominant ranking is that it implies that there is a single model of what a good quality law school is. And if you don't fit that model, then you actually don't look like a good law school, when in fact you're just different.
Great, good, thank you. We're going to come back to you about that, but I do want to turn then to Bob Morse. And Bob, again, we know this is a busy time for you. The rankings will come out on Academic Insights and embargoed tonight, so we appreciate you sharing our time. And there are a lot of things I want to ask you about, but first, just a reaction from you to what Michael just talked about. What are the greatest challenges for you in applying one set of metrics across the different missions of the 200 law schools?
No, it's a very good question. Well, I'm not sure exactly where to start, but I would say a couple of things. One is that you know, there are a lot of law schools, 200, and we are using, which is true, the same methodology across the 200 law schools. It's also true that the indicators we're using, we believe on a broad level, are indicators of quality or measuring aspects of law schools, no matter if you're a national law school or a regional law school. And that's actually part of the issue, where it's been very difficult or impossible to actually define categories of law schools like there is in a pre-existing form, like in the Carnegie classification, which we use in our best colleges. There's a standard education, well, an agreed upon education standard for Carnegie, whereas in law schools where it's true, I'm sure it's an accepted truth that a school and that some schools are geared to producing lawyers for that state or mega primarily, and other schools are at a minimum serving a national or way broader mission. But U.S. News doesn't think it should be us to actually designate if 30 of them are regional schools and 150 or 100. It should come from the legal profession to actually say what a law school is in terms of a category of type, because we have adopted the single approach of measuring, using the same ranking factors and all the indicators, because we think it's measuring things that are valid: jobs, admission, resources, reputation. So those are all can be valid in each case from the ranker's perspective.
Great, thank you. Thank you. Michael, before I get to our two deans, let me just turn it right back at you.
Yeah.
So one of Bob's points is that law schools themselves don't divide into categories as they do in other disciplines. Any reaction to that?
Well, I mean, and Bob and I have talked about this before, and I think it's true. But at the same time, different law schools have their different missions, and I think it's a real problem, trying to think about how to make those categories work. But I guess I would almost ask the people in the law school world to think about how, if there are different ways you can come up with a different system of evaluating law schools to stand side by side with this system, or if there's a way to divide out law schools that makes sense to everyone that people would agree with. But that's a collective action problem that law schools themselves might have to think about as a collective, collectively.
Yeah. I'm going to ask Dean White. Trish, you've been a dean at a couple law schools and spanning over several decades, have just a great reputation.
Not several, just 20 years.
Okay. 2 law schools. Yeah. Trish, if you were going to look at the phenomenon we're talking about here, which is trying to apply one set of metrics to multiple law schools, when in fact you have deaned it 2, and during your time, the prominence of U.S. News has certainly gained, as it did during my couple decades. What advice would you provide
to U.S. News?
Yeah, is there a better way to rank the variety of law schools?
I'd like to respond both to you and to what Bob said. U.S. News doesn't seem to be shy about deciding what the metric should be and how the methodology should be and what the percentage of each little factor should be and changing it slightly each year, that doesn't seem to bother them. They're arrogant enough to do that. I'm sorry, Bob, but not.
No, that's okay.
But not, you say you can't decide categories which would, in some way or another, cluster schools that would regard themselves as similar in mission. And so I guess my question has a part of, did I just hear you say that if we in the legal profession and among the deans and the law schools gave U.S. News cluster groups in different categories, that would cause you to rethink this sort of unifying, this sort of ordinal ranking of 200 very different institutions? If so, that would be fantastic. And I think that those of us who have been around for a long time and people in the leadership would be in the position to make some suggestions in that way. So that was very encouraging as far as I'm concerned. Now, Ken, your question, I don't know if that's just enough for this answer. I'll have more to say later, maybe.
Okay, thanks. Well, this is provocative, and we will come back to you. Dean Yuracko, I want to ask you, your perspective. You're a senior faculty member, and previously you have served in a dean's office. But I think this is, your first full-time year, and you're at, a highly ranked, prominent law school, Northwestern. What pressure do you feel as a dean at a highly ranked school, as you start, the first several years of your deaning career?
Well, you're right. This is my first year as dean, and I will confess this is my first year where I'm awaiting the U.S. News rankings, and I do confess to feeling some anxiety, some nervousness about the rankings being released tonight or tomorrow. But what my life involves as dean has really been a series of discrete decisions being made on behalf of our school. And each decision has been made with a focus on mission and goals. And so while I do sort of feel this overarching kind of cloud of U.S. News, I do have to say throughout this year, the decisions that we face are really, they're decisions about how we are going to define ourselves. And having, I think, more rankings would be helpful. It would allow the group of our 200 law schools to sort of decide that we are going to recognize a broader range of factors. But I think each law school, I'll certainly speak for us here at Northwestern, we work really hard to articulate what we think distinguishes us. And we're going to continue to work hard doing that, whether there's one ranking or whether there are multiple rankings. It would perhaps be a little bit easier if there were multiple rankings than just one. But I feel like the burden is going to continue to be on us and really, to some degree, as it needs to be, to say, this is our mission, these are our goals, and to make our individual decisions in furtherance of those goals, and also to articulate what those goals are.
Dean Yuracko, appreciate that perspective. Just a quick follow-up. As you think about some of the pressure, and I certainly felt it, is it more internal or does it come from one of your constituent groups? Is it students, alums, faculty, campus? Because you have so many insignificant but discrete constituent groups.
It's interesting, Ken, because I expected to hear more concern about rankings, frankly, from our alums than I have. And in fact, I actually hear the reverse. Now, I'm not, perhaps a little naive, but I'm not totally naive. I think if we dropped significantly in the rankings, I would be hearing about it from our alumni. But I actually have not only had no pressure about the rankings, I've actually heard from more people saying, don't worry about the ranking. I mean, really wanting to be assured from me, particularly our alumni, that the decisions that we were making were really goal-based and mission-based and not rankings-based. And again, I don't want to sound completely naive. If there was a big drop, I'm sure I imagine I would hear that from our alumni. I would hear some concerns. But really, the concerns that I've heard most throughout this year from our alumni community have been about let's talk about mission. Let's talk about support for students. Let's talk about support for alumni, and make sure that the things that we care about, and certainly some of the things that we really care about, are already factors in U.S. News, but not all of them. So we care deeply about the diversity of our student body, and making sure that we have a diverse student body is not a factor. It's not sort of figuring into the rankings. And so that's part of who we are. It's part of our mission. And so we're making sure that we're, and I think what our alumni want to make sure is that we're making decisions that are right for our community and that are consistent with our stated goals and mission.
Okay, good. Thank you. I want to move a little bit and talk about reputation and scholarly impact. Given who the audience is of this program, the audience is aware of the percentages and breakdown between the objective data and the reputation. The reputation goes in two categories, bench and bar and peers. Bob, can you tell us, I know you recently put out information about the new scholarly impact survey. We'd love to hear more about that from you.
Well, I mean, we just, around a month ago, we launched data collection or an attempt to see how successful we are, you know, to create a scholarly impact ranking that's measuring the impact the faculty at any given school is having in the law field. These are being done already on a lighter, and there's other people who are doing scholarly impact rankings. So that this isn't something that U.S. News is the first entry, using a business term. We're not the first entry in the market. So, we believe, we're doing it, we think, at least for, I guess, two primary reasons, that we think the students who attend law school, prospective students or students themselves, care about faculty quality, and they are aware of, you know, if their faculty members or the faculty as a whole is having an impact in the legal field or academic field, and that'd be at least one indicator of faculty quality. So we think students care about it, and so that's at least the one, you know. And we've also had in our rankings themselves, we are using faculty resources, sort of using dollars to measure faculty resources. We're not measuring faculty quality. So this could be, you know, a better measure of faculty quality, or at least faculty quality with scholarly impact. It's definitely not measuring teaching quality or what goes on in the classroom. It is definitely not doing that, but we think it's a worthwhile thing to at least attempt to do. Let's see how successful we are in doing it. As anybody who's done rankings or writes a book, you know, just because when you start off doing something, you say something's going to happen, we're confident, but until we actually publish something and people think it's credible, then that's going to be a measure of our success.
Yeah, Bob, as I talk to different deans and you know, chairs of faculty committees, a lot of discussion, obviously, of your partnership with Hein on this. One of the questions is, but it won't count books, and they'll say our faculty does a lot of books. How do you? Is it just showing one of the limitations of any counting?
Yeah, there are limitations to what we're doing, and I guess it's not counting books. And I guess I am not an expert in how the most well-known, I think the lighter ranking or scholarly measurement is using Westlaw, and they're doing it. I'm pretty sure that's true, and so we know we're using this system. You know, we believe we're starting this way for this time. If we can evolve into getting a broader array of more like books or other publications to give a broader measure, that'll come in later times. I mean, this is our first step.
Sure. Thank you.
Do I think books are having an impact, yes.
Yeah, good. Thank you. So, Michael, here again, we'd love for you to help to broaden our perspective and understanding, and you know, maybe a two-part question. One is how you would view this, the new impact to help. Does it help in terms of the otherwise subjective nature of reputation? And then what are other disciplines doing? Is anyone else trying to do a similar scholarly impact for other rankings?
Yeah, to answer the second question first, I don't know of any other fields that have done this prominently and included it in a kind of a major ranking system. So I'll have to look into that more, but none that I've studied pop to mind. And I think any alternative measure is good in a sense. Anything that can get you to look at a variety of ways that we can think about quality and talk about quality is good. But, you know, it's kind of like you don't know, kind of following what Bob is saying, you don't know how this is going to turn out, but you also don't know how it's going to be received. I mean, we've had other measures, you know, in the law school world, but they have not, you know, kind of achieved. They haven't been seen as legitimate, or they haven't been known to enough people to really compete with U.S. News. And I think the same kind of danger or problem, you can see the same kind of problem here, in that people might look at this, but is it really going to override the general ranking that exists out there? Is it going to make people think differently, or are they just going to default to that big ranking? And that's, I don't know. But you think about the diversity ranking that was kind of along with U.S. News for a while. I don't think, and again, my impression was that didn't change how people thought about schools overall, but maybe something like this can. And I think the more attempts we make at new types of assessment like this, the better. So I think it could be positive, or, you know, I think it's positive no matter what, but I don't know how much it will actually threaten the people's overall conceptions of law schools, I guess.
Well, our hope is that it's going to be not take away from our current ranking, but to be in addition to. I will make a couple of points, even though I wasn't called on, but I apologize. That I would say the global rankings in U.S. News do involve citation analysis and bibliometrics, either from Scopus or the Web of Science, where this may be different in the sense that those rankings don't have, because it's an arts and science field, law don't have a lot of journals as part of what they're tracking. So the only way to actually do a deep dive on this is to get with a large publisher who's coded the journals, and eventually we'll get more and more if we're successful. I think one differentiation that we hope to make in the other people who are out there who are doing the scholarly impact in law is our aim is to have as many schools as possible versus just the top 25%. That'd be one differentiation that we would attempt to do.
And if I could, we've got a question that's come in that's very related to this topic, and I'd love to hear the reactions of our deans. The question is whether it might be misleading to students to focus on scholarly quality, and whether that really is a proxy for faculty quality. And I wonder if our deans might, maybe first with Trish and then with Kim, reflect on that audience question.
Okay, I have a couple of things to say. First is that incoming law students really aren't interested, as a general matter, in faculty scholarly work. And that's different from people perhaps who go to graduate school in a particular field where they've studied the field as an undergraduate, and now they're going to go and get a PhD, and they want to go to the department that has the faculty that is best in this little subset of whatever the overall subject is. Those are much more savvy consumers of scholarship coming in. The typical law student applicant doesn't even know really what law is, and certainly doesn't know which area they're going to want to specialize in, and certainly isn't thinking in terms of law review articles. In fact, sad to say, most students don't read law review articles. faculty do, and it's an important part of ours as a learned profession to have legal scholarship, but I don't think it's really particularly relevant to students coming in, if that's the audience, unlike other areas. Students care about teaching quality. They care about the professor who gives them time, who is kind, who is smart and makes it clear and stimulates their intellectual lives. And so then that raises issues with respect to some of the things that just going with Hein, this is just if you're going to continue to do this, or if you're going to pursue this, that you're not taking into account not only books, not only chapters, invited chapters in books by OUP and other places like that, and typically senior good scholars at law schools are now writing invited pieces to lots of different kinds of things. They're not doing submissions to law reviews. And so that changes. Doesn't take account of interdisciplinary appointments. People who are, which a lot of very good and very serious scholarly schools have faculty who have 2 homes, and maybe their university only allows there to be 1 tenure home, and maybe the tenure home is the other department, but they're in the law school, they're teaching law students, they're part of the intellectual life. Both my school and Northwestern are examples that are filled with places like people like that. And they are writing in areas that aren't going to get picked up by Hein and Line because they're writing broadly. And then the other sort of surprising thing is, whenever you talk to judges, I was just with the Ninth Circuit judge this evening, earlier today, and they don't read law review articles. They have long railed from Harry Edwards on about law review articles and legal scholarship not being relevant to what they do. So if you're talking about legal influence in the field, you might want to be also looking at citations and cases, because there are, of course, pieces of writing that have made a huge difference in where we've gone and how the law has evolved. And then the final thing is you get a lot of citations sometimes by being perverse and doing something, controversial and contrarian, and then everyone uses you as the site of this particular example. And so it's a kind of a line to go down which allows for lots of gaming, which is a bad thing on the part of schools and scholars, but it also just misses a huge part of the richness of legal scholarship, which is interdisciplinary and which includes books, it includes chapters, it includes lots and lots of other things.
Thank you, Trish. Kim, your thoughts on that issue?
Yeah, I think Trish raised some really good points about what citation counts would miss, both in terms of the kinds of scholarship that they're unlikely to get, and also in the sense that citation counts don't get at what students probably care most about, which is the teaching experience. I do think, though, our students do care about, they want to feel that they're being taught by leaders in their field. And again, citation counts, while not perfect, I think are sort of one proxy, for a reasonable proxy for this idea of whether someone is a leader in their field, at least among our research track faculty. And so citation counts are something that we do care about internally. So sort of to my last point of, a number of the U.S. News criteria are things that we would care about whether U.S. News cared about them or not. Citations are one that we care about and we have cared about, recognizing their flaws before U.S. News decided to calculate them. Again, we worry about the kinds of publications that will be missed. Also, citation counts are particularly not a good reflection of the extraordinary quality, particularly of our clinical faculty. And one thing that we've worked on over certainly the last year when I've been in this role, but previously as well, is how do we assess and how do we share the tremendous work that's being done by our clinical faculty? Citation counts don't get at that. So certainly imperfect, like I think pretty much all metrics are. I think there's some usefulness to this one.
Thank you so much. I want to turn it back over to Ken and note that in one way, I know Bob hears so much about hoping that we find metrics other than just financial resources by which to measure. And it's also the case, I know that as deans, we've all seen the great examples of the way that faculty that are very active scholars really bring that into the classroom and really bring that to life for their students. So it's also not as if there's a real clear split between the teaching and the writing. Thank you both, deans, for your comments. And Ken, let me move back to you now for your follow-up.
Yeah, thanks. So, first, Bob, everyone, is guessing whether maybe in the future the impact will come and be part of the general overall survey. But I want to ask you about a little bit different issue on the reputation. This year, U.S. News changed the way that it ranked subject matter specialties, right? So you want to explain that change and, what motivated it with U.S. News?
Well, I mean, yes, that is true. That the survey that we used to do, we're ranking 9 law specialties or disciplines or subfields. I'm not sure the right, or curriculum areas. Not sure the right way of saying it, but clinical or legal writing or health or intellectual property, to name a few, tax. That we thought the way we were doing it by giving people a list of the top 15, circling 15 out of 200 wasn't that sophisticated, and we could produce a better ranking. This is from a ranker's perspective, by having people with knowledge in the field, since we believe we're surveying people who teach in the field that we're surveying. So we get names from the law schools of people who teach or work or practice in clinical or legal writing or tax. And so they're experts in that field or work in that field. So they're rating the other schools. So we thought that would produce a better, more sophisticated list, and will produce a longer, rank many more schools. It usually ended up to be between 25 and 40 schools. The new system produces longer lists. I'm not going to say exactly how much longer, but they're bigger than before. It's mainly the schools that were invisible in the other system because it was only doing, in essence, 20% or 25% of the law schools are now. Many more schools are visible in this ranking.
Good, thank you.
Well, we believe it'd be helpful to students, since these are fields that are being taught at their school. Some giant percent of law schools have tax law faculty, or clinical training is an ABA requirement, and legal writing in some form is an ABA. These are things in some cases that are part of the curriculum, and it's worth having some kind of assessment for as many schools as possible.
Thank you. Kim, I want to ask you, at your law school, which is highly ranked in some subject matter areas, was this change in U.S. News a topic of discussion at Northwestern?
Absolutely, it was. I think we're really not sure what the result is going to be, though. I mean, we're not sure whether it's going to have significant changes in the rankings. I mean, one thing that's been, odd as I've tried to sort of get my hand around these subject matter rankings, and particularly I've focused on the clinic ones, is that it is all reputation based. There aren't, so with the law school ones, there's the reputation, which is a big chunk, but then there are other sort of more concrete metrics. With the clinic ones, it was all reputation, and now with sort of the new methods, I guess, for how they are polling people, we're just really not sure what the results are going to look like. So we're kind of, I think, sort of agnostic as to the changes, because we sort of just have no idea how things are going to change. Again, I think internally what we've been focused much more on ourselves is sort of the difficult task of us articulating to our prospective students and to our community how we evaluate the success and the strength of our clinic. And so we actually have been articulating our own kind of objective factors, like student access to clinic. How many semesters can students take? Are there wait lists for clinics? What's the diversity of our offering? And so we're trying to be much more articulate about our objective measures, about how we are measuring our success in clinic, because I think particularly with the subject matter rankings, there's very little information that's really coming through with these rankings. Very little that's really substantive, because it's just all vague reputational stuff.
And I have another burning question from the audience here, and it asks, we're not sure if Mr. Morse would be willing to share this today, but we're curious if he'd be willing to say whether he thinks it's been dramatic change, moderate change, or hardly any change, given some of the methodological changes we're discussing.
Well, in fact, I did say that the biggest change is this will enable us to rank a lot more schools. I'm not going to say how many more, and I did say that schools which are probably invisible before, there's some likelihood that they'd be visible. That's about as much I said I wouldn't talk about.
Understood.
I mean, they're going to be public on our website on March 12th.
Thank you.
Yeah. I'm going to, Dean Yuracko mentioned diversity maybe 10 minutes or so ago, and I want to talk about the impact of rankings on diversity, student diversity and inclusivity, and even what the rankings may do differently to count inclusivity or to credit inclusivity. So again, I'm going to start for a broader perspective with Michael. How do other rankings of other disciplines look at the issue of student diversity?
Yeah, I think it's difficult. I don't see a lot of variation in how other fields do this. Again, it's, some fields do it by keeping diversity a separate ranking on the side, kind of, so people can see how diverse schools are. But then there's always a lot of discussion about what counts as diversity. How do we define diversity? I mean, if you're in any higher education context right now, that's a debate that's going on. So it's, diversity is a hard thing to quantify, first of all. And so how to fit that into a quantitative perspective is difficult for all the rankings. So I don't, I don't see, I think the thing that's similar across context is mostly that it's a hard thing to either incorporate or to measure, and just like it is for law schools. And we saw that a lot with law schools. It really puts a pressure, having a single definition again of what law school quality is, it really puts a pressure on schools to make a choice often between being more diverse and being more like what that template wants you to look like. So I guess that's how I'd answer that question.
Yeah. When deans get the U.S. News submission, it's maybe a month, 5 weeks after they get the annual questionnaire from the ABA. Dean White, the ABA does ask questions in the annual questionnaire about student composition. Your school is particularly diverse, has a very inclusive student body. Would you favor including some of that type of data in the U.S. News, in a sense, to count the significance of diversity in the rankings?
Well, as you can probably tell, I don't believe that things as complicated as institutions of this sort are subject to ordinal rankings. I think it's much more complicated, and I'm all for data, and I'm all for putting data out there. But what I object to is taking data which can be discrete, which can be combined in different ways, and combining it in a way somewhat, without anybody having much impact on it, which puts an ordinal ranking on people, and I think, and on institutions. And I think diversity is such a thing. I think there are institutions which are far more diverse than others. There are lots of reasons why that's true. I happen to think that diversity is a huge advantage in a big law school, or in law schools generally, and that's data that should be out there. People should be able to see what it is, but some places it's easier for than others. For example, I used to teach at the University of Utah. It was a lot harder for the University of Utah to have a deeply diverse student body than it is for the University of Miami for clear reasons. And so I think that data should be out there, but it shouldn't be subject to something which is acting as if it's got this percentage of impact on what is going to be number 1 or number 37 or number 127. But I also wanted to say another thing, which is related to something that Michael in his book has said, and that is one of the unintended, really unpleasant consequences toward diversity by these rankings. Because the rankings, which in order for the magazine's rankings to change from year to year, it's got to pay a lot of attention to input differences and output differences, because those things change slightly every year in the way faculties don't turn over, facilities don't change, budgets don't change. None of that stuff changes. Basic reputation in the profession doesn't change. What changes is the tiny differences in GPA or LSAT coming in and the tiny differences in employment going out. So those things have disproportionate importance in terms of what the rankings are going to be, which generates therefore a different list, slightly different list every year. And one of the consequences of that is that students or schools have moved away from need-based scholarships, unless they're very wealthy, and they give their scholarships based on merit, where merit means your high score, your high LSAT, and your high end of your LSATs and high end of your GPAs coming in. And what that does is systematically leave less by way of scholarship aid for often the most diverse and most needy of and the least backed up by parents, as it were, in the background, students, potential students. And that's, I'm sure, not what the effect has been, but the effect has caused law schools to pay a great deal of attention in order to preserve their student body quality on those very clear metrics. And that means that they, as I always say, Bill Gates' daughter gets the scholarship if she has a nice high LSAT, which I bet she does.
Okay. Can I make one short comment?
Please.
In our, this isn't to disagree with what Dean White said, but I will say that in our best colleges rankings, we added social mobility which is different on one level than diversity, even though it's measuring, because there's data available at the undergraduate level that because we're using Pell Grants and Pell Grant graduation rates, so it's a standard measure for the proportion of students who are from lower middle income to even lower to very needy, and how successful they are at graduation, at least as a way of both measuring social mobility and income diversity. So, I mean, in the law schools, there isn't that kind of, there's data on the proportion who are getting grants or something like that, but there isn't any really economic breakdown. And so, I mean, I guess that'll be a challenge to, I'm not just saying U.S. News has incorporated, at least in our best colleges ranking, measures of these kind when there's data available, at least on income diversity.
Thank you. Kellye, do we have some more questions from the audience you might want to?
We do. We just got a few in, and as I turn to those, I also want to note that, you know, from the law school candidate's perspective, this is a particularly difficult issue. Both the scholarship issue that Dean White noted, which is really something that's, I think, changed a lot, that really is very difficult for first-generation students or any student really with financial need, that so much of the scholarship is merit-based and fairly narrow in the definition of that merit. I also want to note, you know, for the audience and for our panelists to reflect upon too, that One of the things we talk a lot about at LSAC is how to use our test properly. And we give guidance that within a 3-point score band, you really shouldn't be making very fine distinctions, that it's a very good predictive test, but within score bands, not so finely tuned to, you know, the difference between a 158 and 159 or what have you. And that's something that we want to just make sure that we keep asking legal education to think about, because it is something that is important to use the test, but use it right, and to use it as just one factor in a holistic admission process. And that's just an issue that I hope we can all keep talking about, because that's critical for doing admissions with the integrity that I know that all of us, you know, hope to achieve. It's
if
actually,
I can interrupt for just
please.
1 second, Bob, if you would change the LSAT measure that you use in the rankings to a band, which reflects the psychometric reality, which Kelly's team is there. Of course, that would mean that you wouldn't have as much fluctuation every year in terms of what the rankings look like, but it would be it would be very salutary, and it would give schools a lot more ability to be freer to give more, just call it need-based financial aid, not be so locked into the current system.
I'd be interested in exploring the mathematics of your idea. I'm not sure I completely understand it, but I get now is not the time or place to try to explain that. I mean, we are using the median, so if you accept students under the median, or then your median, you have a lot of flexibility because we're using the median, but I get you're making a different point.
We'll come visit again and
Yes.
talk about that, Bob.
Okay.
I want to take a question from the audience. It's been asked whether it might be possible to include some kind of a student review of teaching in the U.S. News rankings, and what Bob and the deans and others would think of that idea, so that they would reflect a little bit more about teaching, and also a little more of the student perspective on the institution's quality.
Would you?
Sure, let's go ahead, Bob, and start with you, and then I'd love to hear the dean's reactions to that too.
Well, I mean, we have student reviews on our best colleges website. I'm not sure of the exact plans to introduce them on the best graduate schools website. So there's a possibility they could be there. I mean, it's hard to control for that. There's real people making real reviews that have had a real experience at the school. So it takes a lot of, we're not in the position to execute that in a way that people think they're reading real reviews, at least for graduate schools.
Kim, let's turn to you and your thoughts on how to include, or whether to include, something like that.
So it's certainly really appealing when one sort of starts thinking about it, because certainly one of our core goals is to educate our students well, and so the quality of our teaching is sort of a core focal point of our mission. It's central to what we need to do. But I think anytime we think about these metrics, any individual one of them, one can think about the problems with them. And so, Bob was getting at the sort of, well, how do we do the measurements? One thing internally, we certainly care a lot about, we care about teaching evaluations, and we make them public to our students, but we also worry about them. We talk about the biases that seem to be systemic in teaching evaluations. Now, some of those would sort of even out across schools, so it's not like one school would be particularly disadvantaged, probably. But I think what the conversation sort of suggests is, I love the idea of giving students really good comparative information about how schools are doing with regard to teaching, because I think we probably all agree that teaching success is something we should all care about. So it's probably a pretty unified metric across all 200 law schools. But figuring out how you measure it and thinking about whether there's any metric that's really free from problems, I think this just highlights that every metric is going to be difficult and have its own problems.
Sure. Trish?
Well, I totally agree with Kim, and the problem goes back to my core objection to putting ordinal rankings based on a formulaic basis. Because if you say, here's the best law school and here's the 39th best law school this year, you're leaving all of those things out, but those things are relevant, but they're deeply difficult to quantify, and we don't really think we can do that. You can't just say Professor X is the best teacher and Professor Y is the 5th best teacher. That doesn't work, and you can't use student evaluations to do that. You use them much more as abilities to sort of see who's doing really well or who's having trouble in the classroom and working on that. Similarly, the other thing that's very hard to quantify is the general satisfaction of students' experience. How are they treated at the school? What is the ethos of support in the school? How do the systems work in the school? You know, is it everything a fight in order to get what they want? What's the breadth of the curriculum? How flexible is an institution to changing to student needs and being reflective of that? That's all part of the experience and actually very difficult to quantify. And so somehow I think that what we've fallen into is a trap of thinking that you can actually take a subset of the important differences between institutions and put them in some kind of a formula which provides an ordinal ranking, and then leave the putting together of what that formula is going to be to an enterprising magazine, which has managed, to its great credit, and I give you congratulations for this, Bob, given what your job is, to get a monopoly, as Michael said, on this in a way that has had enormous effects and has caused enormous collective action problems among the deans in the law school. But I think the fundamental question is raised by, what is an institution? What's institutional quality? It's much more complicated.
Michael, I want to turn to you for your thoughts on this. Your book that title Engines of Anxiety, that captured it for, I think, a lot of us. And given, the research you've done, would you have advice for students and how to think about these rankings in a healthy way?
Yeah, I mean, it's difficult. I think that, by far, and we've kind of touched on this already, but by far the most important piece of advice would be that the small differences in ranking that these ordinal rankings produce are not meaningful. So you were talking about bands earlier, Kellye, and I think, I was trying to think today, like, what would I, tell people? It would be informative for U.S. News to actually provide statistics or a sense of statistically significant differences among schools. Because especially in the middle where all the schools are packed together, and we've looked at this quantitatively, but even differences that appear large, like the difference between 20 and 50, are not that large and are likely not statistically or substantively different. So trying to get that message across to students that these could be like a general guide to schools, but you can't use them to make any sort of fine-grained distinctions between schools. The other idea I was thinking about today was that a lot of times students say they pay attention to these rankings because they think employers pay attention to these rankings. Now, our research kind of had a mixed, we didn't find that some employers pay attention to rankings, but I think the majority really don't, depending on, where they're hiring students from and what their networks are and ideas like that. But maybe somehow getting employers to communicate to students that they're not overly concerned to rankings might kind of take some of that pressure off students coming in to pay attention to those small differences. Now, that's easier said than done. I don't know exactly how you would do that, but given that their employment opportunities coming out of school are so important to them, trying to temper that push with some more information about how employers use rankings or if they use rankings and things like that. But getting them less focused on those small differences, I think, is one of the things I would really emphasize.
That's really helpful. And I do want to note that I think that is one of the things in the legal field that's led to more anxiety about the rankings, is that some law firms have begun to draw pretty hard lines about which schools they interview at and which ones they don't. And that obviously is something that students then pick up on and think about as they're making those decisions. I think that's something that I hope is changing, and there's been again a bit of broadening as firms have realized really the diversity imperative that a lot of their clients are pushing hard on. And I hope to see continued growth in that area among legal employers, because it's very important, I think, for many reasons, including the one you mentioned.
Thanks. Yeah.
Good. Ken, you look like you're about to ask something, so let me defer to you, my partner there.
Well, I want to ask a question, and maybe I'll go to Dean on this. Dean, you've been critical of the rankings during the program. It's one of the reasons we wanted you here and get your perspectives. But if it wasn't for the rankings, how would a school with a previous quote lesser reputation move up in the rankings? So we know that there are even biases against schools maybe regionally or that don't have a name, or that newer schools. What would be the mechanism, if not for a ranking, by which a school could move up in a sense and get more attention from scholars and students?
So I'm asking, let me be sure I understand your question. Are you saying but for the rankings?
Yeah.
Or are you saying given the rankings?
If we didn't have the rankings, so like my old school moved up, the rankings actually helped in that regard.
Yeah, here would be an example if you didn't have the rankings. That could be very useful. Schools, and there are lots and lots of reasons for this to happen. Schools could not all try to be all things to all people, which they're now forced to be. You could have schools that had less by way of resources than the wealthier schools or the very top schools or the biggest schools, and they could choose areas in which they really wanted to excel. We had an example of that with Vermont, for example, in environmental law, where they have a faculty that's really just a superb faculty and huge depth in their offerings in environmental law. That was a conscious decision that they made, and it made sense. If that was the subject you wanted to study, it really would make sense to think hard about going to Vermont. And you could have a lot more of that. Now, Vermont has undergone, partly, I think, because of rankings, it has undergone some very serious economic problems. But I think that you could find a lot more specialization in choosing areas that made sense for particular institutions. And sometimes it would be to pick something that was a strength in your own university, and so that you could be playing along with strengths in your university or your community, and really trying to build that kind of strength. Basic curriculum, of course, because you're going to get a law degree, but not feeling that you had to have a professor who taught each subject or going through. And we don't do that in law as a general matter, but every department in the humanities does that. If you look at an English department or history department or philosophy department, they're going to have strengths, and they're going to focus on those strengths. And that doesn't mean that, and so if you're going to go get a PhD or even be a really top-notch undergraduate, you're well off going to the school that plays to your strengths. And I do think that the rankings generally have harmed us exploring other ways to do that kind of thing. And so if I were a school that had a potential niche area and could get attention to that area based on that niche. I mean, I did that at ASU, for example, with Indian law. There was a whole lot of reason for Arizona State to be preeminent in Indian law. And we got there, and that made a whole lot of sense. And what that also did was mean we would have about a sixth of our student body would be Native Americans, and we had as many as 32 tribes represented in our student body at one point. That didn't help our rankings, probably hurt our rankings, but it was a point of real pride and real academic success. And Kellye knows this because she did the same thing in Washington. But in Indian country, that made sense to do. And I just think you'd see an awful lot more of that throughout legal education. I think it would drive the costs down. I think it would increase access. I think it would drive faculty to go to places more where they had real colleagues and weren't sort of, so I think that would ultimately increase academic happiness, because you'd have a lot of colleagues writing and thinking about the same problems. And I just think the albatross in the room with respect to a lot of this is having a dominant ordinal ranking system. I'm happy to, to have you have you push these buttons, Ken. This is good.
I'm going to ask a final question, then turn it over to Kellye. And I know we want to explore some audience questions and questions about, how candidates should use U.S. News. Kim, I want to ask you, one of the themes that you've talked about this afternoon is about really focusing on the mission of Northwestern and the things that organically make your school a great law school. Let me just push a little bit on that and ask, let's, as like we did with Trish, say there's no U.S. News rankings at all. Would Northwestern be doing anything differently today? Was there anything that you do because of the rankings? A different way of putting it.
As I said earlier, really, not all of the parts of the U.S. News ranking are things that we would care so much about. But some we would. Student quality we would. I think, Dean White's point is really a good one, which is without the rankings, what we would have is a more sort of greater diversity of what schools decided to shine their lights on, in a sense, what they decided to sort of spotlight on. I do think, though, at Northwestern, so we're putting a lot of spotlight, for example, right now on our clinic. I don't know that does, I don't know if that's going to do anything with regard to the U.S. News rankings, because the clinic U.S. News rankings, again, are sort of all vague to me. So we're spotlighting on our clinic and we're choosing our own metrics, again, that matter to us because we think they're important to students. So we're highlighting things like our student-faculty ratio, and we're highlighting the diversity of our clinics. So would we do things differently without U.S. News? We're doing things not because of U.S. News right now. So again, it's not that I don't feel the cloud of U.S. News. I do, and I do think this pressure of one ordinal ranking and pretending that this is what matters is a real disadvantage to all of our schools. But I think we're all agreeing on that. I mean, I think we're all agreeing that it is neither an accurate reflection of reality nor healthy to think that all schools should be rated on one metric. And I think certainly at Northwestern, we are able to be shining our light on sort of all of the things that really matter to us, some of which, again, matter to U.S. News and some of which don't.
Yeah, great.
Thank you.
Kellye?
Great, thank you, Ken. So, Bob, I have one suggestion that's come in from the audience, and then I have a question for you. The suggestion is to consider the law school survey of student engagement as a tool that could possibly feed something into the U.S. News rankings around student satisfaction with their school, and that data set might be one that could be helpful in bringing students' perspectives into the rankings. So that's the suggestion from our audience. I also have a question, which is, the question is, why are the schools, when you send out your rankings, always in alphabetical order? And wouldn't social science research find it preferable to have those more randomized, so that when people are filling out the reputational survey, it's not always starting with A and going through Z? And I was convinced that was really the problem when I was at Washington. So So
Kellye, I liked it. I thought it was perfect.
the only problem is I thought of Yale, and then that argument didn't make much sense. But what are your thoughts about how you list the schools when you do your reputational surveys?
Well, we're listing them by state in alphabetical order within each state. I'm not a social science expert to know whether it would make any meaningful difference. I mean, I think you can probably argue it both ways, that it's more random, but you could argue it that some people in the law field think of a law school and it's located within a state, and that's part of its identification. And if they saw, school X with Creighton University or a school that's not University of Iowa or something, they need that state to help in its identification. So I'd like to talk to more social scientists before we considered it.
Sounds good. I know you have a lot of people there that are interested in that as well. So thank you for that. I want to ask each of you to maybe make a closing comment and really, we've covered a lot of ground today, but there may have been things with regard to this March Madness topic that you really wanted to explore. So I'd ask maybe start with Michael, and then to the deans, and then to Bob for some closing remarks of a couple minutes each. And then I want to also explore at the end just a little bit more about some advice we might give to candidates thinking about their decision about legal education. But Michael first, anything that we didn't cover you'd like to make sure we treat here?
Just, to emphasize again that the development of competing public frameworks or assessments, I think, would really help in the situation. I can't emphasize that enough, because multiple rankings, and I could see this very clearly in the comparison with business schools, not only give schools different avenues for distinguishing themselves, kind of like what Dean White was talking about, where people can actually choose their path. They have limited paths, but they can at least choose which type of school or which evaluation fits them best. But having multiple forms of evaluation also signals to students and other constituents that there is more than one way to determine school quality and educational value. I mean, it just kind of implicitly shows you that, because there's different ways to measure it. And then the other point I would make, which has come up quite a bit, and which I, Wendy Esplin and I are really, is the theoretical point we're trying to make in our book, is that, some things are very difficult to quantify. And one of the issues with rankings in general is that if it can't be quantified, it's discounted. And so, I think one of the challenges, again, is to think of ways to incorporate qualitative assessments into this process to balance out these quantitative components. Things like fit, the character and spirit of the school, the diversity of the school, strengths in particular specialty areas, some of the things we've talked about today. I know this is easier said than done, but how to think about how to really bring that back in, since that's what was lost once rankings kind of took over. Thanks.
Thank you. Kim, let me turn to you.
Following along what Michael said, I think more information and more data points are typically very helpful for students, both because I think there's going to be a range of different kinds of things that different students care about. And also, as we've touched on today, each data point alone has problems. And so the more data that you sort of put out there, the more different data points there is something that becomes sort of more valuable in the clumping and in the sort of the diversity of the data points. I do think in sort of very broad strokes, there is something probably informative that comes from the U.S. News rankings. I think more competing rankings would be helpful, and I think the U.S. News ranking, as has been said multiple times today, doesn't give useful information at the granular level between schools, and I don't think it was really intended to. And so I think additional forms of information and allowing schools to really do, again, what I hope we're doing here at Northwestern successfully, which is shining the spotlight on the pieces of information that we care most about to help sort of show where our values are and what our goals are, is a way to modulate somewhat the potentially distorting effects that can come from having this one singular kind of rating system.
Great, thank you so much. Trish?
I think I've probably said what I wanted to say, and I certainly agree with both Michael and Kim. And I think I'd like if we could later think about ways in which one of the modulating mechanisms could be clumping schools into groups. Different kinds of groups and different kinds of categories. And you have done that at US News in certain kinds of, as you said, with some of the undergraduate educational institutions, Bob. And I do think that that's something that could be very, very useful, and could be very useful for a whole lot of schools, and most importantly, useful as consumer information for the groups of students and their parents who are making choices about where to go to law school.
Very good, thank you. And Bob, we appreciate you joining us today. Closing comments from you?
Well, I mean, it's been definitely an interesting conversation. And I hope people don't think that, at least I'm personally, or people at US News would be surprised that there's strong feelings among law schools or law school administrators or at other institutions that we're ranking, and they have, and those are definitely valid concerns that have been raised, and we should think about it very carefully. And I'm not sure of the audience of the 300 people, if it's mainly academics or people working at law schools, or some of them are prospective students, but that, we definitely believe that the US News rankings shouldn't be used as the sole indicator or the sole metric, the sole decision-making factor. That going to law school is an expensive, at least at a lot of schools, and time-consuming choice, and you're making a choice that'll lead you to a career. So you need to, go way beyond the US News ranking and think of many other things, the programs that are being offered, the costs, financial aid, the location, the career success potential, and just to try to get as an in-depth view of the school and how you potentially fit into it. And then the ranking should just be at most one factor in that. People shouldn't draw a line in the sand and say, I'll only go to it if it's above this line. That would be a misuse of the rankings. I realize people may, but that's our feeling at US News. Certainly we're open to these other discussions. I'm not saying that we would promise to create categories, but if the legal community, I don't want to say banded together, but came up with some agreed upon categories or groupings, US News would have to take those very seriously because they don't exist now. And if there was agreed upon categories, then that would be something would be new to the marketplace. How you could use them analytically would have to be determined. But we're certainly open to see what happens.
Great. Well, we really appreciate that openness. And I want to just wrap up today by, first of all, saying that, to Kim and to Trish at Northwestern at Miami, we're so fortunate to have your leadership in legal education. And we really appreciate you being with us and all that you're doing to advance legal education. And Michael, we really appreciate the work that you've done. You've helped illuminate this important area for us, and we're glad that you were able to join us today, and appreciate the book that you've written that I think helped all of our thinking advance on this topic. Bob, I've thanked you. I know that you're in the business of selling magazines or online hits, I guess, today, but I know that you are very busy, and it's great to have you with us. I want to just close by saying a final word to the law school students and candidates that are out there, because many of you have mentioned today the importance of institutional fit. And I'm here in Philadelphia with the nation's board of pre-law advisors, and they work, every day very closely with all the students who want to go to law school, helping them find their way in that enrollment journey. And we today talked how important it is to find the right home to pursue legal education, and just how fortunate we are here in the United States to have such high quality legal education at so many of our institutions. So I do want to say to you, the candidates, visit the school, get to know it, really find out what it's about, what it feels like there, what the students are like, what the faculty's like, how who the deans are, and how that feels to be in that city and in that school. And trust your instincts about that, because being happy in a place is a precondition to really being able to thrive. And there are a lot of great places out there that you can thrive in legal education and help us all build the future of justice. So Ken, it's a great pleasure to host with you, and I want to ask everybody to tune in next month. Our first Monday in April will be a program on leadership in law, and we look forward to you joining us then. And in the meanwhile, wish everyone a great day, and thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.